Hi everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Insights with Insight. I am Amanda Armstrong, and I'm so excited to launch this podcast in October. It's the beginning of the holiday season for us, and we are those neighbors with all the inflatables in the yard. And we also have all of our birthdays towards the end of the year, so it's my family's favorite time. And bonus, October is also ADHD Awareness Month. And honestly, I can't think of a better way to kick off than by tackling one of the most persistent and harmful myths out there. The idea that ADHD is overdiagnosed and that kids are just being kids. Before we dive into the research that I've got to share with you, I do want to tell you something about my personal life. I was a teacher in the public school system for a little over 20 years, and I heard this myth over and over again. Faculty lounges, staff meetings, just casual conversations in the hallway. Anytime a new 504 or IEP would come into the school, the conversation would turn to, oh, another ADHD diagnosis. Parents are just using this as an excuse to get extra time on test. These kids don't really have ADHD. And I'm sure if you've been in the education space for any amount of time, you have heard that sentence at least once in your career. When in fact, that sentence is actually what started my journey into special education. I eventually went back to get my master's degree, and it was focused on special education, mostly because of this just lack of understanding in the general education classroom about things like executive dysfunction. I just felt that there was just limited understanding of how ADHD impacts like planning an essay or task initiation or working memory. And these are educators, these are my peers, these are colleagues, and we're supposed to know these things and we're supposed to know these kids. And it was a very dismissing of these struggles that were often discussed in these faculty spaces, that these children were just, it's laziness or maybe manipulation of a system. And I was so frustrated with it that I just really wanted to make sure that I understood the science and the research behind it. And so I want to share that information with you. And then I see this myth in parenting groups still, that they often think that it's unfair that students with additional time are sitting in their children's classroom next to them, or this narrative, it's just wrong and it's really harmful, and it delays diagnosis for a lot of kids, and it increases stigma, and it just leaves kids struggling without the support that they desperately need. And so today we're going to look at some of the research and what the research actually shows and who's being missed and why this myth really matters so much. So let's get into it. Okay, so let's talk about what people are actually saying when they claim ADHD is overdiagnosed. It usually sounds something like, too many kids are being diagnosed with ADHD these days, or doctors diagnose ADHD after a 5-minute appointment, or maybe you've heard, we're just labeling normal, energetic kids, or maybe even something as far as big pharma is driving unnecessary diagnosis to sell medication. And I get it, I really, really do. And this narrative comes from a place of genuine concern. Nobody wants kids unnecessarily labeled or medicated. But here's the thing, does that concern actually equal evidence? Because when I started digging into the actual research, and not the Facebook post or not the opinion pieces, but the peer-reviewed studies, what I found was pretty shocking. And it's the exact opposite of what that myth is claiming. So here's what the research actually shows. A comprehensive 2021 meta-analysis looked at data from 36 studies. It covered 104,000 children across multiple continents. And what they found, I literally had to put my coffee down when I was reading it. Only 19.1% of school-age children with a formal ADHD diagnosis were receiving medication. 19.1%. Let that sink in for a second. That means that 80% of kids with diagnosed ADHD weren't getting medication, even though it's a first-line evidence-based treatment. But here's the kicker. For every one person using ADHD medication without a formal diagnosis, there are 3 patients with a formal diagnosis who could benefit from medication, but they aren't getting it. So the undertreatment problem is 3 times larger than the overtreatment problem. So if ADHD is overdiagnosed, why are 80% of diagnosed kids going untreated? It just doesn't add up. The math's not mathing. And it gets even more concerning when we look at who's being diagnosed, or more accurately, who's not being diagnosed. For example, girls are significantly underdiagnosed. Girls with ADHD are more likely to show inattentive symptoms. Things like difficulty with organization or forgetfulness or daydreaming. They're not bouncing off the walls. So teachers and parents miss it a lot of times. And these girls are more likely to develop things like depression or anxiety or have low self-esteem because they're struggling without understanding why. And I taught so many girls over the years who were just slipping through the cracks. Bright, capable girls who couldn't keep track of their assignments, who would zone out during instruction, or who felt like failures simply because they couldn't figure out why school was so hard for them. And nobody was connecting the dots. Another area of concern is children from minority backgrounds. They are also underdiagnosed. So in one study, ADHD diagnosis rates in a Wisconsin county were only 3.9%. That's way below the national average. Things like cultural factors, language barriers, lack of culturally competent healthcare providers, and just distrust in the medical system all plays a role in this underdiagnosis. Also, formal evaluations are really expensive. So lower income families are facing huge barriers. So financial constraints, lack of insurance, and limited access to specialists. All of this means that kids who need help just aren't getting it. And adults. Adults are vastly underdiagnosed. In one study, 17% of parents screened positive for ADHD symptoms, but only 3 had ever been diagnosed, despite nearly half saying their symptoms caused severe impairment. If ADHD were really overdiagnosed, we wouldn't see these massive gaps across gender, race, income, and age. Now I kind of want to go into a case study with you, and this one really illustrates why this myth is so dangerous and how it can even become weaponized. So there's a family that I know and I've worked with where the mother tried to get her youngest son, Riker, diagnosed when he was in kindergarten. The parents were already separated at that point, and there was a restraining order in place against the father, and it didn't include the children, so he still had parental rights and input on medical decisions. The pediatrician used the Vanderbilt assessment from teachers and the parents, which gathered all this input. And the mother's assessment and the teacher's assessments all aligned. They were seeing significant struggles with attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, executive function skills, and definitely some emotional regulation issues. But the father's assessment was completely opposite. He marked everything as Riker's fine. There was no acknowledgement of anything associated with the ADHD diagnosis on the father's assessment. And so because the scores didn't align, the doctors refused to diagnose. So Riker entered kindergarten without a formal diagnosis. And this story kind of shows that doctors don't just hand out ADHD diagnosis. One conflicting assessment was enough to stop the process entirely. But in this case, that he's fine evaluation wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was part of a pattern of control and abuse. The father was using his parental rights to block his son from getting help. It took about 2 years and legal intervention for the mother to get sole medical decision-making in order to move forward with the formal evaluation. So 2 years of expenses and lawyers and court appearances, and even teachers were going to court to tell the judge what was going on. And in that 2 years, Riker had gone through kindergarten and first grade, which is a horrible, horrible experience. He was isolated at a desk facing a wall in front of the rest of the students. His mother constantly got emails and phone calls about his behavior because he puts the H in ADHD. And he really struggled to make friends, and he was super behind academically by the time he got to second grade, and he was scoring in the lowest range possible for both reading and math. His second grade teacher pushed for an IEP based on a specific learning disability because of his low test scores. The school worked with the mom to get accommodations in place. His behavior improvement plan really changed his task initiation and his work completion. His teacher gave him a visual schedule, and he got a sticker with each task that he completed. Those stickers were tied to rewards. In this case, Riker was motivated by food, and so the mom chose to use M&Ms in this case, and Riker would get some M&Ms for his morning task, and then during dismissal, he would get his afternoon M&Ms. Eventually, the reward system was phased out by the end of the year, and he didn't need the rewards anymore. His test scores showed improvement, but he was still not quite on grade level. Once the mom finally got medical decision-making and Riker was put on medication, everything dramatically changed. He ended third grade with above grade level scores, and in fourth grade, he has straight A's. He's got friends, he loves school. He does his homework totally alone, and he's thriving. But here's what breaks my heart. It didn't have to take 2 years. If the system had been more supportive, if there had been better safeguards to recognize when one parent is blocking care as a form of control, Riker could have had those 2 years back. And this case also shows something really important about this myth of overdiagnosis. One, he's fine assessment was enough to stop the process. Doctors aren't just handing out diagnosis. If anything, they're being overly cautious. And when that caution is exploited by an abusive parent, kids suffer. That's what this myth cost. It cost kids years of struggle, years of feeling like failures, years of isolation and frustration. And for what? Because we're afraid of overdiagnosing? Now, some people assume ADHD diagnoses are handed out casually, but Riker's story shows us the opposite. Proper ADHD diagnosis is actually really rigorous. It involves a comprehensive clinical interview with parents and teachers, rating scales from multiple sources, a developmental history going back to early childhood. There's assessments across multiple settings, so these doctors are looking at home, school, social situations. They're ruling out other conditions, and they evaluate functional impairment. So the symptoms have to significantly impact daily life. The DSM-5 criteria are very specific and thorough. A proper diagnosis isn't a quick checkbox. In Riker's case, one conflicting assessment was enough to halt the entire process. Now, are there doctors who don't follow best practices? Of course, just like in every medical specialty. But that doesn't mean ADHD itself is overdiagnosed. It means we need better adherence to diagnostic standards and better training for providers. So why does this myth really matter? Because it causes real harm. Parents can delay seeking help. If a parent believes that ADHD is overdiagnosed, they might wait to get a struggling child evaluated. Meanwhile, the child continues to struggle academically, socially, and emotionally. Early intervention really matters. Delays can lead to anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. We saw that with Riker. 2 years of unnecessary struggle. And now he shows some severe anxiety that is often looking like an OCD situation. Also, stigma increases. The overdiagnosis narrative suggests most ADHD diagnoses aren't real. This makes it harder for people with ADHD to advocate for themselves and access accommodations. It's why those educators I witnessed felt comfortable dismissing students' needs. And this myth can be weaponized. As we saw in Riker's case, the myth of overdiagnosis can be used by abusive parents to block their children from getting help. When the cultural narrative is doctors hand out ADHD diagnoses too easily, it becomes easier to dismiss legitimate concerns as overreaction. And existing disparities worsen. When the narrative is ADHD is overdiagnosed, the population's already underdiagnosed, so girls, minorities, and low-income families face even more barriers to getting help. Here's what maybe we should be more concerned about. We need to address the variability in diagnostic quality. We also need to look at access barriers. So comprehensive evaluations are super expensive, and so that's something that limits a lot of low-income families. There's often a lack of follow-up after diagnosis. There's clearly an over-reliance on medication alone. Treatment should include therapy, skills training, and accommodations. And there's a lack of safeguards when one parent blocks diagnosis as a form of control. These are legitimate issues, but they're not evidence of overdiagnosis. They're evidence that we need better, more consistent, and more accessible care. If you're wondering whether your child might have ADHD, here's what matters. You should trust your instincts. You know your child best. If you're noticing persistent patterns of inattention or hyperactivity or impulsivity that is impacting their life, get them evaluated. And seek a comprehensive evaluation. Look for providers who conduct thorough assessments, that they gather information from multiple sources and discuss both medication and non-medication options. Know that diagnosis opens doors. An ADHD diagnosis isn't a label that limits your child. It's a key that unlocks understanding, accommodations, and effective support. Riker's stories show that. Once he had the right supports, he flourished. And if you're co-parenting with someone who dismisses your concerns, document everything. Keep records of teacher communications, report cards, behavioral incidents, and seek legal counsel if necessary. All of those items were really important for a judge to give Riker's mom full medical control and decision-making. Your child's well-being is worth fighting for. It's also really important to remember that you're not alone. 11.4% of children have been diagnosed with ADHD. That's 7.1 million kids in the U.S. Your child isn't broken. You're not failing as a parent. ADHD is a neurological difference that responds well to proper support. So, is ADHD overdiagnosed? The research says no. If anything, it's underdiagnosed, particularly among girls, minorities, and adults. Are diagnosis rates increasing? Yes, absolutely. But that's because awareness is increasing. Understanding is improving. And we're getting better at recognizing ADHD across diverse populations. Should we be concerned about diagnostic quality? Absolutely. We need consistent, rigorous, accessible practices. But that's a different conversation than claiming overdiagnosis. And the adults living with underdiagnosed ADHD deserve better than myths. The next time someone tells you ADHD is overdiagnosed, you can confidently share what the research actually shows. Because our kids and the adults living with undiagnosed ADHD deserve better than myths. They deserve what Riker finally got, the right support at the right time. And honestly, they deserve it a lot sooner than 2 years. This is ADHD Awareness Month. Let's use it to spread awareness of the truth, not the myths. Thank you so much for joining me for the very first episode of Insights with Insight. What do you think? Have you heard this myth before? Have you or your child struggled to get an ADHD diagnosis? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. You can reach out to me through the show notes or on social media. And if this episode was helpful, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss future episodes where we'll continue tackling myths, sharing research, and supporting neurodiverse families. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.